Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Trudy Rubin, Worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm delighted to welcome General Phillip Breedlove to a discussion of how does Putin's war on Ukraine end. General Breedlove is a retired four-star general in the U.S. Air Force. During his 39-year military career, he held 8 major commands across 4 continents during both peace and conflict. And this culminated in his position as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO from 2013 to 2016. He's currently a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and he has been very active in speaking out on the need to help Ukraine win the war that Putin instigated in Ukraine. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the discussion, you have the opportunity to submit questions for General Breedlove. To do so, please ask your questions in the comments section at the bottom of the page. And if you're watching from social media, please visit inquirer.com/live to submit your questions. If you have friends who missed this broadcast, they can watch later at YouTube. Just go to Worldview with Trudy Rubin and add General Phillip Breedlove. With that, let's get started. General Breedlove, just to get underway, could you describe how you see the status of the war now? The standoff in the small city of Bakhmut, in the Donbass area, all the talk about a coming counteroffensive. Is this a stalemate? Are we paused for the next phase? Where is the war now?
So first of all, Trudy, thanks for having me on. I enjoy my conversations with you across time, and I look forward to today. So we all recognize that the war was pushing pretty hard going into the quote unquote winter season last fall and early winter. And the winter in Ukraine is characterized by a muddy period, then a hard frozen period, and then another muddy period, and then drying into the spring months. And so we are in that backside of winter. We're in a pretty muddy period. We have not got to the drying yet. And so a lot of the combat is dominated by the impassability of much of the landscape due to the mud, especially for large combat vehicles. So while I don't like to call it the winter season, we have come through a weather period that changed the way the fight has proceeded. Before the winter, we all remember that Russia suffered 2 strategic defeats in the north of Kyiv, north and northwest of Kharkiv, and those were major defeats for the Russian army. And then approaching into the winter, there was an operational size fight going on in the south near the vicinity of Kherson. And Russia was retreated back across the river, and was digging in World War I fashion along the east side of the river. And then the weather really set in. During that time, in the northern part of the Donbass, several fights broke out, which have now centered, as you mentioned, on Bakhmut. And Bakhmut was a relatively small town, and one would wonder why it's so important to the Russians and also important to the Ukrainians. And I think that's a topic we may talk more about later, but frankly, tactically, there are some crossroads in there that owning Bakhmut would allow whichever side to control the flow along those north-south or northeast-southwest roads in that vicinity. But I think as important as anything, we saw that the Wagner group, led by Prigozhin, was after Bakhmut. And I think that's important to note because in Bakhmut is one of the largest salt mines in Europe. And we have to remember that from Putin all the way down to Prigozhin, these are first and foremost kleptocrats who are interested in how they're going to extract money from this whole business. And I believe because Mr. Prigozhin already owns one salt mine in Europe, he was pushing really hard to get this large salt mine in Bakhmut.
We may get back to Mr. Prigozhin, who is the man who is known as Putin's cook and has been leading his own militia and recruiting tens of thousands of hardened convicts out of jail who have been used as cannon fodder in Bakhmut. And it seems that he's run out of jailbirds and is suffering losses and is now criticizing Putin's war. So that's an interesting subject. We'll put it back on the table. But since we're talking about how does this war end, so right now Americans are looking at this and they see this back and forth for inches going on. And there's all this talk about a coming counteroffensive and maybe cutting off Russia's land bridge from Russian territory to Crimea as a critical element. But I want to focus on something that you've said. You have said this war will end when the West determines it should end. So first of all, I want you to define end. What is victory? What do you mean this war will end? Do you mean victory? And then secondly, what do you mean by this war will end when the West determines it should end?
So I would define victory the way that the Ukrainian people are defining victory. If you're following, Trudy, the same polling I'm following, somewhere between the mid 80%, 85, 86%, up to about 92% in some polls. The Ukrainian people define victory as all of Russia out of all of Ukraine. And remember that they see, like we see, Crimea is Ukraine. It is a peninsula of Ukraine. It is not under any way, shape, or form Russian. So the Ukrainian people, I think, should set the agenda for what winning is. And right now, they are strongly in favor of expelling all of Russian forces out of all of the territory of Ukraine, including the Donbass and Crimea. So I would define it the way Ukrainians define it. Now, as to how this war ends, what I've said is that it really depends on the policy of the West, led by the policy of the United States. So if you allow me just a minute or two, there are basically three outcomes we could see. What we know, as we described at the beginning of my time, is that when a well-provisioned Ukrainian force meets a Russian force on the battlefield, the Ukrainian force prevails, strategically defeating Russia in the north, 2 times operationally defeating Russia in the south, and now turning the tide and tactically defeating Russia vicinity Bakhmut. And so if the West adopts a policy to give Ukraine what it needs to win, Ukraine will win. Now, on the far other end of the matter, if the West fails or begins to backslide in its support for Ukraine, and Ukraine has to stand alone against Russia, it will lose. Russia has more depth strategically in kit and people, and the outcome will be very predictable. The middle option is the one that we are talking about, Trudy, in the way that I speak. And that is that if we continue supporting Ukraine as we are today, which is enough to stay on the battlefield, but we are not giving them what they need to win, then in my opinion, in the long run, Ukraine will lose because they do not have the tactical, strategic, or operational depth of Russia as it relates to men and equipment. And so, this quote unquote, what some people call a stalemate, if we allow it to proceed, time is not on Ukrainian side, it's on Russian side. And so that's why I say over and over again, how this war ends depends entirely on the West and U.S. leadership of the West. If we give them what they need, we will not have a stalemate. Ukraine will prevail over Russia, and Russia will be expelled from Ukraine. If we do not give them what they need, then time is not on Ukraine's side.
What do they need?
Well, clearly what we have done now is we have built sanctuary for Russia. In other words, Russia is allowed to attack into Ukraine from the northwest in Belarus, from all the northeast to the southeast from Russia, and then from the southwest from the Black Sea. We allow Russia to attack Ukraine from all of those areas, and we virtually guarantee Russia that Ukraine will not strike them back, at least with Western supplied equipment. Ukraine has been developing some of its own equipment and striking back, but we forbid Ukraine from using our weapons to attack into Russia. We're afraid of what Russia will do, and so we forbid them to do that. So Russia has sanctuary all the way around Ukraine. We do not fare well in wars where the enemy has sanctuary. So item one is eliminate the sanctuary and allow Ukraine to strike military formations wherever they may be.
Including inside Russia, you're saying?
Yes, if there is a large military force in Belarus or Russia that's about to attack across the border, strike it before it comes across the border. Russia is firing from nearly the entire compass, 300 degrees into Ukraine, but we're forbidding Ukraine from firing at all in any of those directions. This is no way to run a war. And frankly, the other piece, which is demonstrative, is we have not given Ukraine the weapons it needs to strike its own territory of Crimea. We need to give Ukraine the ability to hold all of Crimea at risk and make it untenable for Russian forces. So long range, precise strike in various forms in order to be able to take the fight to the enemy like the enemy is taking the fight to Ukraine.
I want to get back to Crimea, which you have said is central. But before I get there, obviously, the administration has held back on giving these long-range fires, these long-range missiles, which, even if they didn't strike inside Russia proper, would be critical for putting Crimea under their range and making Russia stay there untenable. But what do you think would be Putin's reaction? You know, obviously critics of this concept say that Crimea is the ultimate red line, not to mention striking even with precision weapons at bases inside Russia, and that that would drive Putin over the edge. What do you think his reaction would be? Is that sleepwalking to World War III?
Well, let's just back up and look at a larger picture, and I'll get to your answer. The larger picture is that Russia's military forces have failed them inside Ukraine. They have failed them. They have not accomplished the goals that Russia set out. They have lost most of the terrain they initially took in this war, and they are failing them now inside of Ukraine. But Russia's war of intimidation, or if we use military parlance, it's deterrence of the West. That war is succeeding wildly. Mr. Putin wants us to fear that he will do something crazy. if we give Ukraine these long-range weapons. We told Mr. Putin early in this war, we were very clear about what we were afraid of. We didn't want World War III, and we didn't want this to go to nuclear war. So what is it that Mr. Putin feeds back to us on nearly a daily basis, 4 to 5 days a week? A major speaker of some form in Russia talks about going to nuclear war. If we lose this, we're going to use nukes. If you defeat us here, we're going to use nukes. If you give them long-range strike, we're going to nukes. So they are playing back to us the fear that we identified. On a less frequent basis, but about once a week, every 8 to 10 days maybe, we get the story from someone in Russia that this is going to be a long war and that it's going to be a big war, and that American soldiers are once again going to die in Europe. And that's, again, Mr. Putin playing back to us the fears that this administration identified early in this conflict. And so what we know, again, is that Putin's military forces are failing him, but his war of intimidation and deterrence is winning. So I set that as the stage to, are we going to allow ourselves from now till whenever to be deterred every time a nation threatens us in this manner? I would offer to you that our response to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 was inadequate to task. That led to and enabled the invasion of Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. And once again, our response was inadequate to task, and that has led to 2023. And now for the third time, we are considering acquiescing to Mr. Putin's demands and giving him even more land in Ukraine as a reward for his invasion. I've told you this in private once or twice, Trudy. I'll make it public now. What I have learned from raising children and now helping to raise my grandchildren is that if you let bad behavior stand, or worse, if you reward bad behavior, as we did in 08, in 13 and 14, and now we are lining up to do in 23, if you reward bad behavior, you're going to get more bad behavior. So where do we stand against the fact that Russia is going to use its land army now 3 times, 4 if you count 2 different invasions in 14, but 3 different times Russia has used its land and military forces to cross internationally recognized borders, conquer, and then inhabit or hold land in neighboring countries. Is this what we want for the future of Europe? Because once again, if we continue to allow bad behavior to stand or to reward it, we're going to get more of it.
Before I get back to Crimea, which I'm slowly heading towards, obviously there are fears that this could escalate to nuclear. And it hasn't yet, even though there's been these constant threats, as you point out. Why do you believe that Putin would not escalate to nuclear?
So I must give myself, as a professor, I must give myself an F on this subject. Because frankly, for years and even the first part of this conflict, I put myself in the side of he might use nuclear weapons. He might actually do it. Maybe not in a big way, but in a demonstrative way. Once again, his most successful war is intimidating the West and deterring the West. And he might use a weapon to further his intimidation and deterrence of the West. And so, but I must tell you, as this war has drug on, I see the base around Mr. Putin beginning to crumble. Something, again, I grade myself F. I never thought I would see, some of those people fairly close to him beginning to crumble in their support for him. But this war and the long-term effect of the sanctions and other things are beginning, I truly believe, to cause some of his support to falter and some of the support to maybe carrying out such drastic measures to falter around him. Remember again, the leaders of Russia, from Putin down through the various levels of oligarchs, they're all really kleptocrats. They are there to extract money from Russia and enrich themselves. And if Putin makes a wasteland out of Russia, or makes a wasteland out of Russia's industry or economy with his actions, they are going to be unable to extract money, which is their primary motivation. And so I'm beginning to wonder if people would actually support drastic measures by Mr. Putin, because they see their money train walking out the door if Mr. Putin lays waste.
You're talking about if he would use a nuclear weapon against NATO, triggering nuclear retaliation. Is that what you mean?
No, it could be very short of that. Trudy, I would offer that if Mr. Putin uses a nuclear weapon inside of Ukraine, he and Russia will be even more a pariah. I believe the sanctions will tighten. I do not believe President Xi wants to see nuclear weapons going off in Ukraine. And I believe that Mr. Putin will suffer incredibly more tough business in the world if he does that. And so it doesn't have to come to a war between the two. If he pops off a nuke in Ukraine, I think the world will turn harder against him. I think President Xi is going to probably shun him to a certain degree. And I think that Russia and Russia's economy and the people who support Putin will crumble even more than today if he chooses to do those kinds of things.
And presumably, if a nuclear weapon was used inside Ukraine, not against a NATO country, which would lead to something more terrible and destroy Russia, but if it was used, it would be a tactical weapon that wouldn't change things on the battlefield, a tactical weapon that was designed to hit masses of troops and clear a way through troops, which is sort of useless in Ukraine because it doesn't change the battlefield because there aren't masses of troops. Is that correct?
That is correct. So let's just back up and kind of look at a couple of options. Mr. Putin could use what we in the West call a demonstration nuke, a nuke that would have zero value. Maybe he pops it off in the atmosphere somewhere. Maybe he pops it off out over the Black Sea somewhere. Maybe he does what we call tree blowdown and pops it off somewhere where there's a bunch of forest and nobody is tactically hurt. And so that is a demonstration. And again, this is to reinforce what is working for him now, and that is his intimidation and deterrence of the West. He would seek to further intimidate and further deter the West.
Sorry to interrupt, but China, you mentioned China. What was the impact of Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow? And do you think that Xi would allow Putin to lose? Or if Putin's troops were doing so badly, if Crimea were isolated, might that be the point at which China stepped in and sent weapons, critical weapons, to Moscow?
Well, I am not a Xi Jinping expert. What I read from learned colleagues is that Xi Jinping is not a fan of Mr. Putin's nuclear talk. Remember that Xi Jinping and China share an extremely long border with Russia. And what he doesn't want is nukes to start flying, because an awful lot of China are within reach of Russia's tactical nukes. So I just don't think I agree with learned colleagues that Xi is probably not a fan of Mr. Putin going nuclear or being so bellicose with nuclear capabilities. Second of all, Xi has aligned himself internationally with a man who, remember, he has weaponized rape, he has weaponized torture, he's weaponized murder, and he has weaponized deporting children back into Russia. This man is a pariah, and Xi Jinping is aligned with him publicly. I think that a nuclear issue would be kind of a straw in the camel's back as far as Xi's support for Russia.
But I'm not speaking so much about nuclear. What I'm wondering is, can Xi Jinping afford to let Putin lose? In other words, if the Chinese leadership doesn't want nuclear weapons used, might they start pouring non-nuclear weapons into Russia if they felt Putin was on the verge?
So I would once again, Trudy, relate to you what I've heard from learned colleagues, since China is really not my forte. But what I have heard, and I tend to agree with the logic of, is that Mr. Xi is not terribly concerned about Russia's army getting chewed up in Ukraine, because that's an army that he doesn't have to face. Remember the famous microphone leak a few years back where a Chinese general didn't think he was on air, and he said, "I can march for months in Russia and not run into a Russian troop." You know, I think that again, my colleagues that I listen to have talked about Xi is not terribly concerned about Russia getting chewed up in this fight, because that means he doesn't have to. And I heard something the other day that was intended to be funny, but it was said in a serious manner to carry a conversation, and that is, this public display of lovey-dovey is a really drama. The way it was described in this small group was, if Putin was on life support, Mr. Xi would unplug it to charge his cell phone. So there's not a lot of love lost between these two people when it really comes down to who's doing business. And Putin knows that Xi sees him as a useful little brother. We remember how Xi and China just really raked Russia over the coals with the petrochemical deal it did in 2014 when Russia needed friends. So so
in other words, China got very cheap energy supplies, unlike what Russia demanded in price at first.
That's correct.
Well, if that's the case, if you don't expect a major flow of weapons from China to bolster Putin, before I go totally to questions, although I'm weaving a few in here, can you? Oh, yes, you wanted
just
to
correct the record a little bit. I didn't say that China wouldn't send them weapons. I'm just trying to describe the geostrategic relationship is not exactly what it's seen out there. But China may, in fact, I expect at some point will send, and I believe may already have sent some lethal weapons. We don't know the true story yet.
Like drones. Right. You're freezing up a little, so I just want to make sure you're finished. Can you give us oh, yes, good. You have said that Crimea is critical. Looking ahead in the coming months, when supposedly Ukraine will wage a counteroffensive, can you describe to me the kind of counteroffensive, a scenario for how Ukraine could get on the path for victory? I want to get to some questions very shortly, so as succinctly as you can, but how would it look?
So I do believe that what Ukraine is preparing for is an offensive to possibly hold and solidify territory around Bakhmut, again because of the road and rail network in that area. But the focus, I think, will be in the south, as you have described many times, Trudy's cutting the land bridge around in and out of Crimea is important, because it's hard to supply Crimea without that land bridge. They built the Kerch Strait Bridge, and Ukraine held it at great risk and has damaged it, and it's not yet back to 100% supply route across the Kerch Strait. So if Ukraine takes the south, or cuts that bridge, or at least captures again the water supply to Crimea, which is on the Ukrainian side of that isthmus, that peninsula, if they do any of that and they get their artillery close enough to hold the Kerch Bridge at risk again, then they have put Russia at great disadvantage. Remember that the Russian North Sea Fleet is active to some degree in the south and the west part of the Black Sea, but up around Sevastopol in the northwest part of the Black Sea, Russia is not operating its ships right now. And so it would make it pretty hard to resupply Crimea if the bridge is held at risk and the land bridge is cut. So I do believe that they have the wherewithal to have a counteroffensive in the south. We will see if they are able to truly cut the bridge or recapture the water supply. And then they need to get their artillery, because we refuse to give them long-range artillery. They have to get close enough to the shore to hold the Kerch Strait Bridge at risk with the artillery they have now.
And you think that the Biden administration will continue to hold back from giving them ATACMS, the long-range?
So for the whole war, the first answer to Ukraine has always been no. And then after some time, we find our way to a yes. My hope and prayer is that we'll find our way to a yes on things like the ATACMS, long-range precise strike. But who knows where this will go.
And if Ukraine cut off Crimea from resupply by Russia, either by land, by the bridge, or by sea, making it untenable and under their guns, then what? Would that lead to negotiations, or would that simply freeze things, but the war would go on?
Well, I think it would give impetus to Russia to negotiate. Whether it leads to negotiations or not, I don't know. But remember, Mr. President Zelensky is in a pretty tough place. As we talked about at the top of the hour, the people of Ukraine want all of Russia out of all of Ukraine. And so President Zelensky has his own hard rock that he's pushed up against, and that's the will of his own people. So negotiations are going to be tough.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mr. Milley, has said that it's impossible for Ukraine to drive out every Russian soldier from Ukraine. And he has intimated that it's going to be too hard to carry on this war indefinitely. Just gave a podcast repeating that. Is Ukraine in this bind where even if they make this major counteroffensive and are able to cut off Crimea, the war of attrition will still go on, with Russia sending troops in from the north or the west and fighting on in the Donbass and bombing Ukrainian cities?
Well, first of all, I respect Mark greatly. I've worked with him. He's actually worked for me once in the past. He is an incredibly smart man. He's one of our nation's greatest military historians, and he understands a lot. So I respect his opinion. I have a different opinion. I would say that Mark has a pretty good view into what U.S. policy is. And if he knows that the United States is not going to give Ukraine what it needs to win, then that may be the basis for his answers. I do not have access to what U.S. policy is. I watch it play out. And right now, it's clear to me that we are giving Ukraine enough to be on the battlefield and to continue to try to take back territory inside the land boundaries of Ukraine. But I also see very clearly that we are not giving Ukraine what it needs to win. So if that's the policy and Mark is privy to that policy, then I completely understand his answers.
I have a question here. Can this war end without the overthrow of Vladimir Putin? And do you see any signs that might happen?
Well, as I said earlier, I up through even 6 months ago or 7 months ago would have never talked about Putin being replaced or Putin falling. And I am surprised now that I'm beginning to see structural failure in the support to Putin in many ways, even Prigozhin. You said earlier that Prigozhin was taking on Putin. I think more he's taking on Valery Gerasimov and the other military leaders. But the fact of the matter is the kleptocrats around Mr. Putin are beginning to fray. The military strength and solidarity is beginning to fray. And I now put myself in the other category that says it is a possibility. Whether it is likely, I haven't determined yet, but at least now with all the fraying going on, I do not discount the fact that it might happen.
If the U.S. does decide to increase its weaponry and send ATACMS and support at least using them in Crimea, which is their territory, I have a question here that says, are you advocating that Congress should declare war on Russia? There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of this war. I have other questions about, is this a proxy war between NATO and Russia? Can you lay out your thinking on whose war is this? And does Congress need to be involved? And I'll throw in one more thing. We've just had the anniversary of the Iraq War. And many people draw lessons from that, which may or may not have any correctness to them, about getting involved in an endless war. So can you lay out, first of all, whose war is this? Is this a proxy war? And is there any analogy between the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, these endless wars, and the Ukraine conflict?
It is absolutely clear in my mind that this is Mr. Putin's war. It is completely contrived by Mr. Putin to accomplish his goals in Eastern Europe. If you read the two documents that he called treaties, I believe, we call them documents, that he told us we needed to sign about 8 days before this war began, he said, sign these or there will be other means. We now know what those other means were. And if you look at what he lays out in those two documents, we grieve for Ukraine, but Ukraine is only step one. This is much bigger than Ukraine. Mr. Putin wants to completely rearrange the security architecture of Eastern Europe. And in my mind, my words, not his, I believe he wants to reestablish a Soviet Union Warsaw Pact buffer zone, et cetera, et cetera. I encourage your followership to read those two documents. Google them up and read them and see what Mr. Putin is all about. This is Mr. Putin's war 100%. Do we need to declare war on Russia? No, we are working very hard not to do that. Our government has made it clear it's not going to fight or send our soldiers to fight, et cetera, et cetera. This is Mr. Putin's war on Ukraine. And we are trying to give, we, the West, primarily us, are trying to give Ukraine the means by which to fight back. I just want to make one small point too, that yes, we're giving a lot, but on a per capita or per GDP basis, we are not number one. Estonia and others like them are number one. So there are a lot of people giving a lot to help. We just are huge, and so we're giving more.
Another questioner asks, the issue that keeps coming up, would this war have begun if NATO hadn't expanded eastward after the breakup of the Soviet Union?
So I love and hate this question. People talk about NATO expanding like there are these meetings where NATO says, we're going to go after this nation because that'll really make Russia angry. Or we're going to go after that nation because that will advantage us along their border. Or we're going to go after this nation because economically it'll make it hard for Russia. None of that could be farther from the truth. For 3 years as a SACYR, I was in meetings. Every time there's a ministerial, meaning at the chiefs of defense, defense ministers, foreign ministers, or presidential level leader of nation, every time there's one of those ministerials, there is a off-camera, off-script discussion at dinner. And the growth of NATO is almost every time discussed. When I was there, they were discussing Montenegro and others about whether they would come in or go out. I have watched personally how hard it is for nations to get into NATO. These nations that came into NATO scratched, clawed, crawled, did everything they could to get into NATO. And as I have seen personally, NATO puts the big hand out, and it's a hard thing to get into NATO. And so the vision that people have that NATO is this creeping entity that is trying to forcibly make life rough for Russia is completely false. And so if you want to understand why nations like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia fought so hard to get in, remember that they had to earn their independence twice from Russia, and they don't want to have to do it a third time in the future. So I think that Mr. Putin loves to play the card that it's all about NATO expansion. I think Mr. Putin wants to be the next great czar enshrined in the temples there, the history in Russia, as someone that expanded the empire rather than contracted the empire. And I think most of this we're facing right now is completely about that and Mr. Putin's approach to this.
I also have another question that you hear a lot, both from the further left and very clearly from the two leading candidates for the GOP nomination for 2024, which is why should America be funding a war on the other side of the world when we have open borders, drugs, and the same amount of violence as third world countries here and now? To read off this question, why should U.S. tax dollars be spent on Ukraine? What is the great interest that the United States has in seeing that this war doesn't end in a Putin victory?
Well, let me first attack the first premise, and that is that it's either or. It's not either or. We can protect our borders and participate in foreign affairs at the same time. We are completely capable. It is a matter of apportionment and allocation of the dollars that we have. But this nation is, in my opinion, is completely capable of taking care of its borders and participating in important world events and affairs. I would just point, I'm not a big, huge historian, but I do understand history. And there are at least two really good examples of when America tried to be isolationist and let the world go without their help, and what it cost us in the end in terms of American lives and world economy for World War I and World War II were astronomical compared to what we're doing today over there. I believe that European security is essential to and a part of American security. At least half the world's GDP are between Europe and America, and that is a big business issue. People forget how advanced and how important Ukraine is to the world. When the grain stopped flowing out of Ukraine, look what happened on world markets. Look what happened as far as hunger and so forth in the Northern Africa region, the Middle East region, and several other regions of the world that depend completely on Ukraine's grain. Remember that for decades, the United States of America flew into space on Ukrainian space rocket motors. Ukraine builds some of the best airplane engines in the world. That's why China wants so much to buy companies in Ukraine like Motor Sich. So very few understand Ukraine is painted as this backward place, and why are we worried about it? Ukraine is a very technical, very capable, large, highly agricultural nation that is an important part of not only our nation's forward goodness, but is a huge part of the world. And what we don't want is to allow a bellicose neighbor to assemble its army, cross an internationally recognized border, and conquer and inhabit chunks of its neighborhood that are so important to us.
What will be the cost to the United States and to Europe if Ukraine falters because it doesn't have the weapons to win?
So remember, I offered you should go back and read the two documents and look at what Mr. Putin intends. It is bigger than Ukraine. We already see money and political action in Georgia, overturning the government and changing the direction of the Georgian government. We have seen the most Western leader in Moldova and Transnistria deposed by Russian action. So already Russia is working in two new places, and there are more on the roadmap. Go back and read those documents, and you see that Mr. Putin's vision of Eastern Europe is not going to be compatible with our vision of Eastern Europe.
Will this have an impact on China and Taiwan is another question.
Well, I would add a couple of more countries to that. I think that Iran is watching what's going on. You saw Iran use a drone to strike and kill Americans in the last 48 hours or so. I think that North Korea is watching what's going on. I think there's a couple of those nations that are racing to get nukes because they see what happens when a nation threatens America with nukes. They see what is happening as far as U.S. policy right now in Ukraine because of Mr. Putin's, again, he's winning this war of intimidation and deterrence on these kind of issues.
Since you've given a picture of the cost of letting Ukraine lose, I want to get back to your second scenario, which is we give them the weapons to survive but not to win. Can Ukraine survive a war of attrition?
Well, I think that this war of attrition is causing massive problems for Russia as well as Ukraine. But if you just look at the size of Russia and its male population versus the size of Ukraine and its male population, if you look at Russia's well of kit and equipment versus Ukraine's well of kit and equipment minus Western support, in the end, the war of attrition will affect both sides, but I think it will draw Ukraine into the deepest trouble the quickest. That's why I say over and over again, Trudy, how this war ends is 100% dependent on Western policy and U.S. leading Western policy in order to enable Ukraine to win. If we don't, then we'll deal with the consequences.
Do you fully understand why the reluctance is so strong to give ATACMS? I mean, it seems that by now the administration grasps that a lot of Putin's threats are bluster, and there is a real downside to this thing dragging on indefinitely. And there seems to be almost zero chance of genuine negotiations. So does the U.S., the Biden White House, have a strategy to end this war as far as you can see?
I can't read their minds. It's, as I said earlier, Trudy, I think that what I see is that we are giving Ukraine enough to stay on the battlefield. The U.S. publicly says that they don't want to enunciate a winning strategy or policy because they want to allow Mr. Zelensky to make up his own mind, and he may change his mind. It's hard to read those tea leaves, but it sounds like to me that we are hoping that Mr. Zelensky will determine that he can come to the table and once again acquiesce and give Russia more land, meaning reward them once again for bad behavior by giving them more of Ukraine to hold on to. I don't think the Ukrainian people are going to support their leader through that. But right now, I think that we are not getting out in front of this policy because we want to allow Mr. Zelensky the opportunity to change his mind, which begs the question, are we trying to encourage him to change his mind? I don't know. Trudy, it would be inappropriate for me to speculate here. I just see what's happening, and I adjudge what I think our government is doing based on the policies I see playing out day to day.
And if this war moved towards negotiations without first dealing Mr. Putin a tremendous blow, such as putting Crimea under the gun, what then? Would negotiations go on indefinitely? Would this lead to a frozen conflict? You see critics on the right saying, a Korean solution. Is that an end to war, or is that a prelude to more war?
A Korean solution would work as long as the lines are the original pre-2014 lines. If we're going to say you stay on your side of the internationally recognized border and Ukraine will stay on their side of the internationally recognized borders, that's good. I mean, I think
not that's a Korean solution. Korean solution is splitting the baby.
That's right. Well, and I don't think, as we talked about, that the Ukrainian people want to split the baby. They are, you look at your own polling, find the one you want to listen to, but all the numbers are demonstratively, drastically in favor of Russia out of all of Ukraine. And so can Zelensky survive negotiations when his electorate has a position like that? That's an interesting thing. And then we fall also back to my original analogy of my children and grandchildren. If we continue to reward Russian bad behavior, we're going to get more Russian bad behavior. In other words, if we have a settlement that gives Russia even more land to reward them for their criminal, inhumane intervention in Ukraine, we're going to get more of it.
In other words, if history is the guide, the war would just restart. Russia would start it again after a breather.
I would even get more.
Or stand back and let a ruined Ukraine crumble.
I think that their every intention is what they have done now, which is they have cut off Mariupol by destroying it. They are occupying Sevastopol, and the port of Odessa is completely dominated by Crimea as long as Russia controls it. And so Russia has the wherewithal to economically, literally ruin Ukraine by blocking all of their import-export, which they did for a short time before the world went crazy on it.
Well, just to wrap up, one of the things that has been the most amazing about Ukraine is how tech-savvy and innovative its soldiers have been. They have developed weapons of their own when the Americans have failed to give them. I've heard from Ukrainian friends who have reason to know that when Israel isn't giving them Iron Dome technology, air defenses, there are Israelis in there, I don't know, on a private basis, and I can't prove this to be true, but instructing some Ukrainians to build their own Iron Dome. They are trying to build their own more dangerous drones when the US won't give them the drones that they most want. Do you see Ukraine perhaps as the David that can innovate its way towards holding Russia to account?
I'm kind of at a loss as to how to answer that. I think I would revert back to what I've said sort of all through this thing to close it out. The Ukrainian people are speaking about how they see their future. And I believe we in the West should support that future. One of your questions from a person was, in other words, we should declare war on Russia. No. Ukraine has asked us not to bring our men there. They don't need our men. They need our help. I believe we should enable the Ukrainian people in a sovereign way to determine their sovereign way forward. And I think the West should not allow a nation like Russia to rape, torture, murder, and kidnap children as a way of waging war in today's world. We should not allow that to stand. And so enable Ukraine to do what they want to do, and then let this sort itself out.
The last question I'll ask, which was submitted, is what can the average American do to ensure that U.S. funding to Ukraine continues, especially with GOP would-be candidates making clear that they would cut it back, and also House GOP far.
As you pointed out before, Trudy, it's on both sides. The far left and the far right are the problem areas right now.
Absolutely.
The beautiful piece is that there's a lot in the middle on both sides of the aisle that are for. And so I would say do what you should do is contact your elected officials. I happen to live in the district of one of those far right people who have a really interesting approach to this. And I am I've written now 3 times. I haven't gotten anything back, but I am attempting to be able to communicate with my leadership on these issues. And I would say make your representatives understand you. Wherever you find yourself, you may find yourself out here, or you may find yourself in here trying to find a durable solution. But make your voice heard with your elected leadership.
Thank you so much, General Breedlove. And with that very salient point, we'll draw this to a close. Thank you to the audience. Please keep following up on this. It is rewarding to know that so many people care about this subject. And as General Breedlove suggested, there are things you can do. I look forward to our next Worldview with Trudy Rubin. You will get an information. And don't forget, you can see this again or advocate it to your friends on YouTube. Goodbye for now.